this was the perfect case, and there was a real serendipity in that their name was Loving, and I imagined how could you lose a case called Virginia versus Loving, or Loving versus Virginia as it came to be known.
The 60s, an era of free love and discovery. The US sent man into space and many men to war. The British invaded with the universal message, all you need is love, and the civil rights movement charted its course into history. Love, though, came at a huge cost for this black woman and white man and their family. Richard and Mildred Loving just wanted to live together like any ordinary married couple. It would be their personal battle that challenged the last piece of legalized segregation in America. The story of the Lovings inspired me to go to America to find out more. I also wanted to discover my own roots, so my wife, Lynette, and I travelled to New York, where I was born just a few years after the Lovings went to the Supreme Court. My mind dwells on the fact that, were we only 30 years older and a bit further south, this story could have been ours. Caroline County, Virginia, is where Richard Loving and Mildred Jeter grew up as childhood sweethearts. This is Civil War country, where many battles have been lost and won. But even back in the 50s, Central Point was considered a community ahead of its time, where the races lived in relative harmony.
My understanding is that nobody really objected to the courtship, that as long as it wasn't marriage, the fact that couples were seeing each other across racial lines wasn't a big deal. It was the fact that they got married that troubled people.
They ignored the prejudice and headed to Washington, D.C. to get married legally out of the state. On June the 2nd, 1958, they tied the knot, then went straight back to Central Point. But it wasn't long after the wedding that someone complained, and the honeymoon was short-lived. In a rare interview, Mildred described what happened next.
It was about 2 a.m. And I saw this light, and I woke up, and it was the policeman standing beside the bed. And he told us to get up, that we was under arrest.
What? Who's the woman you're sleeping with, son?
What?
I'm his wife.
Out here you ain't. Let's go.
In a place like Central Point, the arrest was a big statement. So what was Sheriff Garnet Brooks' primary motivation?
Lore has it that when Sheriff Brooks went to arrest moonshiners who were potentially dangerous, he traveled alone or just with his German Shepherd. Yet when he went to arrest the Lovings, he brought his deputy sheriff and the county jailer for a crime that was clearly not a violent one.
The Lovings were carted off to a local jail in Bowling Green, just a few miles away. It was an experience they never forgot. Mildred told author Phil Newbeck about the conditions in the jail. Richard only spent one night inside, but because she was black, Mildred was forced to endure 5 nights, and Richard was not allowed to post her bail. So this is the door to go in?
Yeah, and the inside must have really been terrible. I mean, imagine the small, cramped quarters, the rats. Mildred really must have been terrified. I mean, she remembers it as the worst time of her life, as unhygienic, as rat-infested, as really terribly frightening.
I tracked down Sheriff Brooks at his home outside the town, but he refused to talk about the Loving case. Like so much of this part of the country, it was now consigned to history. The man who defeated Brooks in 1964 for his job as sheriff is Ottie Moore. He met me at the local courthouse where the Lovings were originally sentenced.
Wow, they've remembered the Loving case.
Moore is retired now, but stresses that Sheriff Brooks was only doing his job.
It would have been a duty for anybody who may have been sheriff to have served if this complaint was made and a warrant was issued. So I think it'd be unfair to state, about him being the one that made it. I guess anybody who had been sheriff at that time would have had the same duty to carry it out.
The Lovings case was heard at the Bowling Green Court. The judge, Leon Bazile, ruled that they leave the state for 25 years or face 1 year in jail for breaking the ban on interracial marriages. He summed up with this astonishing statement.
Almighty God created the races. White, black, yellow, Malay, and red. And he placed them on separate continents. And but for the interference with his arrangement, there would be no cause for such marriages. The fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend for the races to mix. Case closed.
Judge Bazile was really very typical of what you would find in Southern judges in the 1950s and 1960s. And they truly believed in segregation and separation of the races and could not understand those of us who were more concerned with equal rights and integration.
He was just another local state judge, had an unremarkable legal career. He was a racist in a day when people were racist.
Leaving everyone behind, the Lovings fled to the nation's capital where their marriage was legal. The couple had 3 children, yet they longed to return home to their family and friends in Caroline County. At this point, the Lovings were unaware that they weren't even allowed to visit the state of Virginia as a couple.
We had been down a few times before that, but Easter we came down, they found out we was down. They arrested us again.
In January, they had the trial. And they told us to leave the state for 25 years. But the way I understood it, the lawyer said that we could come back to visit, when we wanted to. So that Easter we came back and they got us again.
I went to the northeast of the city to see where Richard and Mildred lived in exile. It was a difficult chapter in their relationship. I went to the northeast of the city to see where Richard and Mildred lived in exile. It was a difficult chapter in their relationship. Forced out of their home state, the Lovings came to live here, Neal Street in Washington, D.C. It's one of the poorer parts of the city now, and it would have been then the colour in the Lovings' relationship gave them few options. They didn't like it here. Mildred in particular really struggled with the idea of being away from her family. And 4 years after moving in, she wrote a letter to the then Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy, and he passed it on to the American Civil Liberties Union. And that proved to be a turning point in the Lovings' story.
That is that
2 young lawyers took on the case of their careers. It was Bernie Cohen who first replied to Mildred's letter.
We have 3 children and cannot afford an attorney. We wrote to the Attorney General. He suggested that we get in touch with you for advice. Please help us if you can. Hope to hear from you real soon. Yours truly, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Loving. And it was that simple letter that got us into this not-so-simple case.
I remember it very clearly. I met them in an office in Washington, D.C. because I could not ask them to come into my office in Alexandria, Virginia. They would have been breaking the law, and we were not interested in getting them arrested again.
Then Bernie Cohen teamed up with Phil Hirschkopf.
They were so different visually. To look at Mr. Loving, he truly had a red neck and short cropped hair. He looked like a Southerner you expect to be against civil rights, visually.
They were a very simple couple, very unpretentious, certainly not civil rights firebrands. Their only interest was in being allowed to move back into Virginia.
Mrs. Loving was so demure and soft-spoken. it was hard to picture them together. And yet, in this stress of litigation, you see people objecting and reasoning, and they never differed in front of us. I don't believe they differed outside of our presence either. They were in complete accord. There was an amazing bond between the two of them.
At no fee, the two attorneys reopened the case in the Virginia courts. Ironically, another defeat in Basile's county court, followed by further disappointment in the Virginia Supreme Court, allowed the Lovings and their legal team to make a much bigger impact.
Remember, these statutes we were attacking were statutes to preserve racial integrity, to preserve the purity of the blood. That's how they were termed in the official language.
The term miscegenation was coined in 1863 to refer specifically to the intermarriage of blacks and whites. It became a loaded buzzword of its time, but it stuck. Virginia led the way in 1662 when anti-miscegenation laws came into effect. As the years passed, the bans on interracial marriages spread to these states in red. At its height in 1947, no fewer than 30 states outlawed mixed marriages. By the time of the Supreme Court decision, 16 states, including Virginia, still had the legislation. New York was one of the more progressive states. It never passed such a law. Otherwise, my parents' situation would have been very different. Nenad and I continued our journey back to my roots. We left Manhattan and ventured over the Brooklyn Bridge to try to locate where my parents settled in the early 70s. It wasn't easy to find, as I had no memory of the place at all.
I don't know how we missed Adams Street. We came over.
But when we finally pulled up, judging by the photos, it had hardly changed.
So that's my mum, and that's me. That's us back in 1974, obviously with some friends of ours.
Look, you're tiny.
Sweeter than I am now.
Yeah, your mum looks really happy.
I was born to a black mum and a white dad, a mixed-race child in a changing country, where many states would have imprisoned my parents only a few years beforehand. A few years, but a different era. That era was one of upheaval for the Lovings. One of Richard's closest friends was Raymond Green, seen here on the right with the couple back in the 60s. They raced stock cars together in a time when a black and white team was unheard of. Green still lives in Central Point, just down the road from Mildred Loving. He remembers the bond between the couple.
They was perfect for each other, you know. They never got into no arguments. They never had no problems. But he really thought the world of her.
These two people found each other, and despite what the legal system did to them, they were lucky that the years they had together, they were so much in tune with each other. They were just, you sensed it, you felt it, you observed it when you were around them. They just really loved each other. They really trusted each other.
The Lovings also placed their trust in Cohen and Hirschkopf to get them back home to Virginia, but it was a long battle.
I told them this case is going to end up in the Supreme Court of the United States. Richard's jaw just dropped in amazement. He shook his head. He could not understand why I could not just go to Judge Basile and ask the judge to let them come back into Virginia.
They took the case right to the top of America's legal system. History was about to be made, but Richard Loving's message was a simple one.
We had asked them to come hear the argument before the Supreme Court, and they said they did not want to do it. And I said to Richard Loving, while he was sitting in my office with Mildred, I said, "Is there anything you want me to say to the court?" Which was really an unusual thing, because we're talking about asking a lay person, does he want me to say something to the 9 honored Supreme Justices of the United States? And he said, "Just tell the court I love my wife." And I did.
We say that the prevention of interracial marriage is a legitimate exercise of state power.
These laws, Your Honors, are ludicrous in their inception and equally ludicrous in their application. Subject to immediate arrest under the fornication statute. And the lewd and lascivious cohabitation.
That is the right of Richard and Mildred Loving to wake up in the morning or to go to sleep at night, knowing that the sheriff will not be knocking on their door or shining a light in their face in the privacy of their bedroom.
A period when the Klan rode openly in the South. And that's when they talked about bastardy of the races, and miscegenation, and amalgamation, and race suicide became the watchword.
From the psycho-sociological point of view, interracial marriages are detrimental to the individual, to the family, and to society.
These laws rob the Negro race of their dignity. It's the worst part of these laws, and that's what they're meant to do, to hold the Negro class in a lower position, lower social position, a lower economic position.
Of interracial marriage, for this reason, stands on the same footing as the prohibition of polygamous marriage or incestuous marriage, or the proscription of minimum ages at which people may marry, and the prevention of the marriage of people who are mentally incompetent.
You have before you today what we consider the most odious of the segregation laws and the slavery laws. And our view of this law, and we hope to clearly show, is that this is slavery.
No one can articulate it better than Richard Loving when he said to me, Mr. Cohen, tell the court I love my wife, and it is just unfair that I can't live with her, Virginia.
So they didn't know it when they got married, but Richard and Mildred Loving would have to come here, to the highest court in the land, just to win the right to live together as a married couple. It took up 9 years of their lives, but this crucial landmark ruling would lay the path for the next generation of mixed-race couples to live freely in every state in America. Richard and Mildred were now free to return to Central Point to live alongside their family and friends without the threat of arrest.
I think we're coming up on Mildred's house now.
All right. This is it here now?
I believe so, yes.
So who would have built that?
Oh, Richard built that house when the court case was over.
Yeah.
It's a very simple cinder block house at the time, but with the proceeds from the movie Mr. and Mrs. Loving, she put some siding on it and the shutters.
They were so happy after that, you know, they were just act like two different people. They was free to go and do what they wanted to do. They wasn't scared no more. They felt so good. I felt good for them, you know.
They came in, they were curious as to what the atmosphere would be and how they'd be received and so forth. So they came in and talked to me and told me it had been handed down, and I told them I was aware of it. And they told me where they planned to move into the edge of the county, and they moved there. And as far as I know, they got along fine.
But this romance ended in tragedy just 8 years later, when Richard was killed by a drunk driver. Raymond Green arrived at the scene minutes after the accident.
How did you feel when you saw him in the car?
I tell you, I didn't know how to feel. You know, that's bad. That was bad. A bad pill to take, cause you know your best buddy laying in the road, you got to help get him out the road. And I just only seen him 15 minutes before that happened.
It was a shock to them when Mr. Loving died. Mrs. Loving has spoken that she really misses him terribly, constantly. But she was always so very shy. She never wanted anything to do with the media, and she was injured herself in the same accident that he was killed in an auto accident.
She loved him deeply, and she missed him, and that she felt that he was the most important, had been the most important person in her life.
Richard and Mildred's landmark achievements have not been forgotten, as Leonard and I discovered. We left Brooklyn and made our way to the largest of a number of parties across the country held to celebrate the anniversary of the Loving versus Virginia Supreme Court ruling. Individuals and couples of different backgrounds and cultures, all brought together by the Loving's story.
She broke my heart, but I love her just the same now.
My name is Ken Tanabe, and I'm the founder of the Loving Day Project, and I'd just like to welcome you all to the 4th annual Loving Day celebration here in New York City. So thanks for coming out. For younger generations, this is a novelty. It's Loving versus what? they can't believe it, you know. And they're sort of very much on board. I mean, a lot of the project is online, so they're online and they get emails from their friends and they see the website. They realize there's an event, and they're more than glad to come out and celebrate and be a part of this positive event.
I think we need to, you know, really make it known that 40 years ago this happened, and if it wasn't for them, a law that shouldn't have been there would still possibly be there.
I told a lot of people about it, and they were really surprised that it was only 40 years ago. And they say, "You sure it's not 1867?" and no, it was only 40 years ago. And I actually think that's a good thing. That there's such an antiquated notion.
The name of the family was Loving, and I think that's just an amazing coincidence that makes it beautiful. To call it Loving Day, you know, is so appropriate, because that's what it really comes down to.
And that, for me, sums up this story perfectly. Ultimately, it's a tale of love. The Lovings were just two people who wanted the right to live together.
I think that marrying who you want to is a right that no man should have anything to do with. It's a God-given right, I think.
They didn't want to be civil rights heroes, but their victory at the Supreme Court made them just that.
I certainly knew that the day the decision came down, it was a landmark in American legal history. When we finally won the case, we put the nail in the coffin of the last legalized vestige of slavery in America.
Mildred Loving has kept herself out of the public eye for many years. More recently, a serious illness has made her stay away from the media completely. However, she did give us this rare personal statement on the 40th anniversary of Loving versus Virginia.
When the court decision came down, Richard and I were elated. The decision impacted our lives and we had some very happy years together. I'm happy for the many couples who will also be able to have happy and loving years together. It makes me feel good to know we had a part in achieving this good and important legal decision.